Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining today, and thanks for Joshua and Adam and Dean and Juanita for hosting this as part of the AMS. So I wanted to give an overview on my thoughts on applying for jobs when you're graduating with your PhD in mathematics. So this is associated to the webpage that you can currently see on my webpage. So I plan to briefly talk about academic versus non-academic jobs, liberal arts or teaching jobs versus research postdocs. I'll go through a bunch of materials that I've shared from when I applied for jobs, postdocs in 2013 when I was a graduate student. I'll talk about letters of recommendation, where do you find jobs, and then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about COVID briefly and my thoughts on how COVID affects anything. So without further ado, let's begin. So first of all, this webpage is mostly targeted towards applying towards academic jobs. That's really all I know. Down at the bottom, I have a couple paragraphs on applying for non-academic jobs. We do have a lot of expertise in our department on applying for non-academic jobs. So Margaret Cheney, Michael Kirby, Wolfgang Bangerth, James Liu, among others, are faculty who have had a lot of their students and postdocs go into industry, business, finance, tech, national laboratories, government, defense, etc. And Brian Elder even has a copy of a book, The Big Jobs Guide, jobs for mathematical students in business, industry, and government. But today we'll talk mostly about academic jobs, although I'm happy to answer questions on non-academic ones. The next thing that I wanted to discuss is I wanted to just talk about sort of liberal arts versus research institution. Can you all see my screen? You cannot. Okay, now you can see my screen. Is that right? Is there anybody out there?
Yeah, we're good. I can see it.
All right, great. So, wonderful. So, of course, the delineation is not fine between research institutions and liberal arts or teaching institutions. You're going to be doing research and teaching in any college or university setting. However, one distinction is that you can't get a tenure-track job at a place like CSU directly out of your PhD. You need to do research postdocs first. So to get a job at a place that grants PhDs, you pretty much have to do a postdoc in math before you can go on to get a tenure-track job there. Liberal arts positions, however, you can get either tenure-track or non-tenure-track positions at a liberal arts institution, one that doesn't have PhDs in mathematics straight out of your graduate program. There's also a lot of schools who have master's programs, but not PhDs. And so there's a lot in the middle of the spectrum. These various schools care more or less about teaching versus research, but they all care about both. All right, so on this webpage, there's a zip file, which I encourage you to download. And it includes my application materials from the year I applied for postdocs. I applied to about 70 different places. So it is a process. It takes a lot of work and organization to apply to all these positions, and it's worth getting prepared ahead of time. All right, let me talk about letters of recommendation first. This paragraph is all I have about letters of recommendation. These are extremely, extremely important, and they matter more in some areas than others. But let's say you're in algebraic geometry. In algebraic geometry, you might not publish any papers at all during your PhD. Then getting jobs, relies almost exclusively on your letters of recommendation. And that's sort of the standard for some areas in mathematics. If you're in a more applied area, maybe it's common to publish more along the way, and maybe the letters of recommendation are less important. So everybody has at least one good letter, which is from their advisor. And however, you'll need 3 or 4 letters in total. So it is important to meet your committee members, go to chat with them once a year or once every 6 months, keep them roughly up to date and invested in your progress as a graduate student, because you'll be asking them to write a letter for you at some point. One of your letters should be able to address teaching, and this could be from somebody like Janet Owen, who won't address your research so much, or it could be from a tenure-track faculty who you maybe invite to attend one of the classes that you're teaching. You can also consider getting a letter from somebody outside of CSU. So if you've written a paper that extends somebody else's research and they're not at CSU, talk with your advisor, and maybe it'd be a good idea to ask this person to write you a letter, even if you don't personally know them. So I think Vance Blenkers a couple years ago got a letter from somebody he had never met, but he had done some work related to this person's work. So yeah, if you're in your 4th year, I would consider talking to 3 or 4 faculty this semester, saying, hey, would you be willing to write a letter of recommendation for me in the fall? Here's an update on what I've been doing. Asking them early is never a bad idea, because faculty are going to get a lot of requests in the fall, but they might be slightly more excited to write your letter if you ask them in the spring or summer. Questions about letters of recommendation? I can't see the chat window, so Joshua, please let me know if folks chat in questions.
Sure.
All right. So let me talk about how you find jobs, academic jobs to apply to. So the main place to look is mathjobs.org. You can do searches on there. If you're searching for jobs in topology, you can search for that. The problem is that it's hard to track everything on mathjobs.org just because there's so much. So in your area, there might be email lists or forums that you want to join, and your advisor might know this. And I would join these email lists, join these forums, and you'll get announcements for jobs in related areas via email or via posts. Questions about finding academic jobs to apply to? Okay, I'm going to start going into descriptions of various materials. So that zip file, which you can download, has sample materials from the year I applied. I think in there I include a couple research statements, a publication list, a teaching statement, and 2 cover letters. So let's go through those one by one. I have in here 3 different research statements. This first one is a short research statement. So it's 2.5 pages with a half page for references. So that's all I was allowed to give them for my research statement. I might encourage you to write a short research statement first. So you write one short research statement, 2.5 to 3 pages, and then you can expand upon that. Some places will instead give you 5 pages. So in my shorter research statement, I have a very short introduction. You might want to expand upon that. But then I break it up into several sections. This was my thesis project. This was the applied perspective of my thesis project. And then I go into the theoretical part of my PhD thesis project. And then I describe a unrelated project. Well, I make it related for the purpose of the statement, but a different project that's also slightly more applied. So you'll notice that I do include some math notation, right? But I also include a fair bit of text, without much math notation, a fair bit of text just describing the general problem that a mathematician in any area can understand. So you're writing to multiple audiences. You're writing to the expert in your field, but you're also writing to their colleague who's not in their field, but they need to convince their colleague that, hey, Henry's a reasonable person to hire. He's not in your area, but he can still explain things to you. Personally, I think including figures is a really good idea. I struggle reading things with no figures. That's just me. You can include figures in a way that don't take up that much space. So here I laid out my figures horizontally so that they don't take out that much space. People often do inset figures where a figure maybe only takes up one small rectangle right there. You do want to include a couple theorems. So I have one theorem from somebody else, and then I have one theorem from me. Here, it's not rigorous notation, but you can change it to rigorous notation. You're not going to be able to add every definition, so your research statement should not start with 3 definitions, but you want practice, describing things that are mathematically rigorous that appeals to experts and non-experts alike. So if you write a research statement this summer, you have the chance to show it to some of your peers or even a faculty member to read over and give you comments. Let me go to a 5-page research statement. So this is a 5-page research statement actually for the location where I ended up getting a postdoc position. So I was a postdoc at the IMA. It's a math institute. They used to have thematic year postdocs, and I was quite fortunate. The year I graduated, they had a thematic year in my area the following year. So in this 5-page research statement, recognize that not many people are going to read all 5 pages. So most people are going to read the first page. So I took the first section of this research statement as a chance to give an overview of my entire research statement. If you read my first section of this 5-page research statement, you would have the main idea of what I'm about and what I'm trying to contribute. I mentioned a more theoretical project, a more applied project, and some software development that I had done. Okay, so again, I have this, the more hands-on part of my thesis project. I have the more theoretical part of my thesis project. I have a more data analysis project, not in my PhD thesis, but something else I had worked on. I have more space, so I talk about open questions that I want to expand upon. If you have space, it's nice to say what you've done and what you intend to do next. Yeah. And, there's definitely sections where here I'm really talking to homotopy theorists. So people in my area, applied topologists, might not like this, but I'm talking to, theoretical topologists who might be deciding whether I get a job or not, even though I wouldn't be working with them so directly. The third research statement that you can download and check out is one that's written for liberal arts or teaching institutions. So here I added a section on research with undergrads. Okay, so this is section 5 here, undergraduate research mentoring. So I was a grad student at the time. I had done no undergrad research mentoring, all right? But I'm applying to these places where I'm not going to have any PhD students. Maybe I'd have a master's student, but mostly my research would be with undergrads. And so I wanted to address, where in my area could I do work with undergrads? And every area has these topics. So I think I talk a little bit about data analysis here. But you can see that I'm tailoring my research statements a little bit based on the place that I'm applying to. And when I'm applying to a liberal arts institution, like Williams or McAllister, I'm saying, hey, here's some projects that I'd be excited to do with undergrads, because that's one thing that they're quite excited about. I'm just going to keep plowing through things. Feel free to ask me questions at the end, but it is helpful if you have questions now. Any questions about research statements before I go on to the publication list?
Actually, Henry, can I ask a question?
Please.
So did you actually end up interviewing at any liberal arts places?
I did. So I think I interviewed at least 2. I forget the name of one of them. It was somewhere in Connecticut. I interviewed at McAllister, though. And this was an interesting interview. It had maybe 3 or 4 faculty on the interview and a couple undergrads. This was at the joint meetings. So I met one of my lifelong friends there, Chad Topaz. He was at McAllister. Now he's at Williams. And yeah, the interview was, so I'll talk a little bit about my advice for the interviews, but the interviews was really interesting. Liberal arts institutions care a lot about fit. And we'll talk about this in the cover letter. the point being, all of you are sort of trained by faculty at CSU who advise mostly PhD students, right? And so, however, if you accepted a job at Macalester, you'd be working primarily with undergrad students. And sometimes the fit is terrible, right? So some mathematicians are just not very good at advising undergrads, or they're not interested in it. They're only interested in proving something about the James Leray spectral sequence, and they can't really communicate with undergrads. And so you need to show these liberal arts institutions that, hey, I know that my job at Macalester would not be my advisor's job at CSU. It would be different in these ways, and I'm excited about being part of the culture and really contributing to the growth of these math majors. Yeah.
Henry, did you actually end up having to, I guess, like give a sample lesson in front of the interview committee too? Or?
I did not. I think that's becoming more and more common. I'll show you my teaching statement. It's quite sparse. It's only one page. I don't have like a whole portfolio of teaching things. So I was never asked to give a sample lesson. They definitely wanted my, opinions on teaching, and you really have to show that you're excited and a committed teacher. Now I think it's more common that if you weren't giving an interview at the joint meetings, but you were visiting a liberal arts institution, yeah, they would ask you, teach a sample class in front of them and in front of undergrads. And they're going to ask their undergrads, what did you think of Adam's lecture? Hey, senior math major, did you think Adam was speaking to you? Other questions? Okay, let me talk about and I'm happy to come back to any of these materials. Let me talk about the publication list. So not every place, but some places will ask you for publication lists. The main point here is don't feel bad if you don't have a publication list. You're a graduate student. In math, it's often the convention that you don't publish anything until you get your PhD, and then you take your PhD and you might make a paper out of it. So I had done one project as an undergrad. That's what this is. And then I had done another project early on as a grad student that had not been accepted yet, but it was up on archive. If you have things up on archive, you should definitely include them in this publication list. You can also put things are under preparation on a publication list. But it's like in preparation is the lowest level. On archive is better than that. And then submitted is better than that. Although if it's submitted and on archive, you should list both. And then accepted is better than that. And then published is better than that. But that it's not a problem if you have nothing published. Joshua, how many places asked you for a publication list?
Quite a few, actually. I'd say probably at least a quarter to a third of my applications wanted a publication list.
Right. So if you're in an area where usually you don't publish anything before your PhD, it's not a bad idea to consider, taking a chapter that you're writing towards your thesis and posting it on your webpage, and you can add it as something in preparation. Here's a link on my webpage. Okay, questions about the publication list before I talk about teaching statement? So the spoiler alert is the teaching statement is the one thing that you might not want to look at very many of before you write your own. So I think it's pretty good advice to write your own teaching statement before you look at 10 others, okay? Research statement, I think it's good to look at some other people's research statement. You can look at mine before you write your own. Teaching statement, you do want to let your personality shine through as opposed to just some vague philosophizing about teaching math. So that's why I might encourage you to write your own first and then look at other people's teaching statements. So feel free to mute me. Joshua can chat out when I'm done talking about teaching statements. I am going to talk about my teaching statement now. I liked this teaching statement. This teaching statement, I couldn't find the ones from when I was a PhD student. This is the teaching statement I wrote when I was a postdoc at Duke, applying for the job at CSU. I had less teaching experience in some sense at this time than most of you did. So as a graduate student, I was never the instructor of record. I was only ever a TA. So I never assigned grades. I never had a class by myself. Oftentimes you all teach calculus classes where you're the instructor of record. That's something to advertise. At least half of the schools, the PhD students will never be instructors of record in mathematics, and you have that experience. So even as a postdoc, I didn't teach until my last semester as a postdoc as the instructor of record when I was already hired here. So this is a teaching statement written as someone who had only ever TA'd, but I like it. I think it shows my personality in the sense that I'm a friendly person, but I'm sort of fairly professional, friendly but professional. And, I sort of try to get to the point, I hope. And that's what I've done here. I make 4 points in this teaching statement, and that's it. I include a figure, which I think is pretty uncommon, but advisable, make your teaching statement stand out in some way. I include some specifics, so specific equations or specific stories, specific questions I ask in class. So the most common mistake, in my opinion, when writing a teaching statement is you make it too vague. Okay, you can make it high level. Things that you care about are accessibility, visualizations, making class a conversation, organization. You can care about high level things, but give in the mud specific examples of those. All right, so what's my teaching statement? I want my students to become confident in their ability to do mathematics. How do I pursue this goal? I make myself accessible. Primarily, I try to learn the names of my students as fast as possible. My students are more confident knowing that I'm in their corner. Second, we discuss the pictures behind a concept. So students sometimes feel that they can solve the homework problems, but they don't know what's going on. And I think pictures help them believe that they know what's going on. So when I'm talking about this formula, for example, I bring in a chopstick and a pointer, and I talk about how the dot product changes as I change the angle between the chopstick and the pointer, and how the dot product changes as I change the length of the pointer. Okay, so quite specific example. I try to make our class a conversation. So I'm a pretty traditional lecture-based teacher, but I think I do a reasonable good job of encouraging questions and conversation in class. And so, I ask just recall questions, help me out. How do I finish this definition of a linear subspace? But I also ask paradoxical questions. So this is a question that might confuse even the best students at first, and sometimes it turns into a conversation. And then lastly, I prepare my board work carefully. So in order to make class a conversation, I think I shouldn't be writing up on the board the entire time. So I really try to parse down the number of words I have to write. So I'm writing exactly what I want to say, but in fewer words so that I have more time to look and talk to my students. So that's my teaching statement. Try writing your own first before looking at a ton of examples, and then go see what other people write. You should touch on how you are interested in improving your teaching. I don't really do that. You should touch on how you're interested in things like flipped classrooms or incorporating technology in teaching, or even if you don't have experience with many of these new modes of teaching, you should say, here are a couple of new ways of teaching that I either have experience with and I like, and I tried it out and it worked, but I want to adjust it in this way, or B, I haven't tried using technology in this way in my classroom yet, but I want to. Questions about the teaching statement? I should say, Adam hit the nail on the head. I think now some liberal arts institutions want a teaching portfolio. They want example worksheets and things from various classes you've taught. If you're making online videos this semester for your class, save a couple of those or 5-minute clips of those, and you can post them on your webpage and link to them in your teaching statement. Questions? Okay, next I want to talk about cover letters. I have two cover letters to show you. One is for a research postdoc. This is a departmental postdoc at the University of Chicago. I say who I am. I'm a graduate student at Stanford. My advisor is Gunnar Carlson. I expect to get my PhD in the spring. In your cover letter, you can briefly describe your research, which is what I do here. And you can briefly describe your teaching, which is what I do here. I touch on a teaching opportunity that I had whose goal was to increase diversity in mathematics. I link to my webpage, and that's about it. I do mention somebody at Chicago by name, okay? So Sheila Weinberger is a professor at Chicago. I had never really met him. I don't know him. I'd seen him give a talk. He is tangentially in my area, and I think it's better to name people than to not. Most of the people that you name, if they haven't met you, they might say, well, I don't really know Henry, so I'm not excited about him. So maybe let's look at somebody else I'm more excited about. Okay, that might sound like a bad thing. I'd name Shmuel, and Shmuel gets asked by the hiring committee, should we hire Henry? And Shmuel says no. But it's really not that bad, because if I didn't name anybody at all, the hiring committee would just say, he's not interested in Chicago. He didn't name anybody at all. And, 30 to 50% of the places where you list a name, the hiring committee will ask Shmuel, hey, are you interested in Henry? And Shmuel will say, yeah, I am interested in moving my research in an area related towards Henry's. And that's where you have a position to get a job, right? So if you name somebody and it's a relatively good match, you have a chance to get a job. If you name somebody and it's not a good match, you're not going to get that job, but you probably weren't going to get that job anyways. So I sort of think of naming people as a good idea. You're sending out a lot of, you're sending out a lot of messages in bottles to random places, and most of them are not going to get accepted, but putting names helps the ones where you have a shot get accepted.
Henry, do you mind if I ask a question?
Yeah.
So when you name these people on the cover letters, do you actually get in touch with them too?
You certainly can. I did not. It's definitely not a bad idea. Say like 5 to 10 places, I could totally imagine doing this. You email them ahead of time and say, hey, I'm interested in applying there. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Francis Mata is a CSU grad. He worked with Patrick Shipman. He was my office mate at Duke because he emailed John Harrer at Duke and said, hey, I'm graduating. I'm looking to move more into applied topology. Do you have any opportunities? And John did and was interested. So I think that's a really good idea, Adam. One thing I'll mention at the end is what happens if you don't get a job? And then your advisor's in the position where the advisor has to decide, let's say Joshua didn't get a job. Do I want to email some of my contacts and ask them to consider Joshua? It's actually much easier if Joshua had, emailed them in the fall, already ahead of time to start that rapport. Let me talk about the liberal arts cover letter. So this is a cover letter I sent to Macalester, a liberal arts institution. Cover letters matter a ton for liberal arts institutions. The point being, on math jobs, you can apply to 70 places at once. And so these liberal arts institutions get flooded with applicants, many of whom don't want to be at a liberal arts institution, okay? So they're in the position where they have a lot of people applying to these liberal arts jobs who ideally want a research postdoc instead, okay? And they want to filter those people out before they spend time on their files, okay? So you need to say something about why you're interested in them. Okay, so here I'm talking about my field I think is attractive for undergraduate research for those reasons. I had never mentored undergraduate research at this point, but I'm saying I'm interested in you, and that's why you should be interested in me. They'll be very interested in what you have to say about teaching. if you attended a liberal arts institution, you should say that. I attended a liberal arts institution and I know the environment and I'd be happy to be at a liberal arts institution again. If you have family in the state, I would put that. You know, any connection you have to a liberal arts institution, I would put. University of Chicago, if you say I have family in Illinois, they might not care. But Macalester, if you say I have family in Minnesota, you know, they'll say, ah, this person actually took the time to individualize this letter to us. And so we'll now take the rest of the time to read their file. So don't overlook cover letters, especially for liberal arts institutions. Many liberal arts institutions are not shy about saying, if you don't say anything that catches our eye in the cover letter, if we could tell this is exactly a cover letter you sent to 50 other places, it's not worth our time to read the rest of your file. It's a lot of work to individualize cover letters, right? If you're looking on web pages, finding names, talking about departments. So you don't know what specific options are going to be open in the fall for jobs, but this summer you can make a template research postdoc cover letter, and you can make a template liberal arts cover letter, right? That talks about undergraduate things. And then as jobs open up, you know, one by one, you can add in a sentence or two individualizing them. Okay, let me talk about the diversity statement. The diversity statement is not included in this zip file online, but if you email me, I'm happy to send it to you. I don't think I am happy with how I described the diversity statement in the version I gave of this jobs talk in the fall. So let me try to do better this time. I think diversity is very important, and if you have done things related to diversity, you should certainly advertise them in a diversity statement and in a cover letter. Most places won't ask for diversity statements, although more and more are asking for them. However, you know, you should read some blog posts. A lot of people in blog posts talk about how, you know, one problem with diversity statements is that it's not your main task as a graduate student in some sense. Your main task is to be an excellent teacher and do a lot of research. And so a problem with diversity statements is that you don't want to sort of penalize people who are really interested in improving diversity, but haven't had time to formally devote their mathematical time to it. So don't feel self-conscious if you haven't done a lot of work strictly related to diversity. You still have things to say. Let me put it this way. So CSU, we had a faculty meeting a couple years ago discussing, do we want to ask for diversity statements for tenure-track applicants? And we decided yes. And the point was, from such diversity statements, even if somebody has not devoted much of their professional time to diversity, you can tell whether they care or not. And it's really true. You know, I took the time to write one page about diversity. We get tenure-track applicants who write 3 sentences on their diversity statement. And we sort of use that as a warning sign. Oh, maybe the cultural fit is not quite right for what we're looking for at CSU. So even if you don't have a lot of professional experience or time that you've devoted in a documented way to diversity, you know, still taking the time to write a thought-out page matters and is a plus, and will separate you above the people who don't take the time to write a serious page. So I had done one summer program, part of whose role was to prepare Stanford freshmen coming from high schools to be ready to be engineering majors. Not all people have the background that you might want them to be at, you know, starting at Stanford. And so this program was getting people up to speed. And so I talked about that program. And then this was for a postdoc at University of California, Santa Barbara. And so I went on the webpage and saw that Santa Barbara had a similar program. And so I personalized this, probably because I didn't have much to say about diversity at the time. And so I decided, hey, I'll just personalize this to Santa Barbara to help get the point across that I do care. Now I have more to say about diversity. I don't have still maybe all that much documented experience professionally doing it, but but certainly as a graduate student, I felt self-conscious writing this, and I don't think you need to. I think you can write a diversity statement without feeling self-conscious about it. Think of programs you've done at CSU, maybe Math Day, and teaching, right? Diversity is inherently related to teaching. So if you've ever taught a class, you should have things to say related to diversity. Questions here? If you've done more with diversity, if it's something that really excites you and you have, 2 pages, 3 pages to write, that's great. And you should advertise it in your cover letter, and places will take notice, especially liberal arts institutions. Okay, that's the end of my zip file of materials. I want to talk about interviews and then some closing thoughts. So back in my day, I sort of thought that liberal arts institutions did interviews, say at the joint meetings, whereas research postdocs did not. It's seeming that that's changing. So Joshua did interviews for both of the research postdocs that he was considering at the very end. This advice also holds for in-person interviews, but I don't think you'll do many in-person interviews. Most of it will be Zoom interviews or joint meetings. So make a long list of questions to ask. Even if you ask 10 questions, they'll always ask if you have any more. Maybe create a short cheat sheet of experiences or interests that you want to bring up in the interview, even if they don't particularly ask about them. So have 3 things in mind that you want to bring up no matter what they ask you. Work it into some question. Maybe something related to coding. Maybe you have a coding skill that you want to bring up, or maybe you helped mentor research for undergrads at some point. If you get offered an interview, definitely scour the folks' webpage to see what they've been up to lately. And then one last word of warning is some interviews are very conversational, and those are the fun ones. Other times, for like Office of Equal Opportunity reasons, interviewees are required to ask the same exact questions to every interviewer. So those interviews feel very cold. Try to figure out if that's the case ahead of time. If they have a set list of questions, you don't want to be trying to engage them when they can't follow up. You don't want to give a short response, teasing them to ask a follow-up question when they legally can't. So if you realize that it's one of these more sterile interviews where they have a set list of questions and they have to ask only those questions, give longer answers.
Henry, are you allowed to ask if that's the case?
Yeah, I think you should. If you get offered an interview and it's not clear, I would email them ahead of time. Hey, just wanted to know, is it a set list of questions or is it more conversational? And you could also ask during. So if they sort of say question 1 and you give an answer and then there's an awkward silence and then question 2, you can just say, hey, I wanted to clarify, is there a set list of questions or, is back and forth allowed? Yeah, I think it's fine to ask up front. This happened to me at CSU. So when I applied for the CSU job, it was going great. Francis Mata was my office mate as a postdoc. So I got all the inside info from him on what the landscape was at CSU. And then I had all these individual meetings with folks. But then I went into the hiring committee interview and it was so dry. And I realized it's because they had this list of questions. So I actually told them in the future, warn interviewees ahead of time that it's a set list of questions so that they know that the awkwardness is not caused by them. All right, so Joshua just went through this experience. He applied for about 70 jobs, same as I did the year I applied. I think he got a lot of emails back from various places saying, sorry, he's not in consideration anymore. A lot of places he didn't hear back from, and you should expect that. He got offered one job, and he was given a 2-week deadline. At that point, he emailed a different faculty member and said, hey, I have 2 weeks before I accept this job, but I'm interested if you're instead still considering me, And then he got offered that second job, which he ended up taking. So he had a very successful experience, but I think still was quite, it's traumatic. It's a lot of materials to prepare, and you get overwhelmed where every week you're searching math jobs, the new jobs show up, you're updating your cover letter, you're searching their webpage, who are names I can list. Nobody here does anything remotely what I do. You send off the cover letter. His advice after the fact was, instead of applying to 70 positions, apply maybe only to 35 and then customize those even more. Okay. And I think that's really good advice. Of course, my response would be, okay, take those 35 jobs that you're really going to customize, really customize those, send those off, and then still apply to the other 35, where you don't spend as much time customizing them. An example of this, so there was a job in Sweden where I happened to know the person, and I think the European timeline is later than the American timeline. So this was getting, near the end of the cycle. And so I forwarded this email to Joshua saying, hey, you should apply to Sweden, just like hundreds of other emails I had sent him. He ended up not applying for whatever reason. I think, he was busy and sort of just, starting to get slogged down with the process. It turned out Chris Peterson, one of his letter writers, also knew this faculty and some other faculty at Sweden. So I was sort of at the time, worried, oh my gosh, Joshua missed out on this opportunity to apply there. So that was sort of my perspective at the time, whereas Joshua's perspective at the time, rightly so, was just very worn out. I think it is worth having a conversation with your advisor. Okay, I'm going to apply to all these postdocs and liberal arts institutions. What will I do if I don't get any of those jobs? I asked Chris Peterson about this. Hey, Chris, I'm really happy Joshua got this job, but what should I have done if he didn't get a job? Should I have emailed, a bunch of faculty I know to say hey, if you have positions open, would you consider Joshua? Chris doesn't do that. Chris Peterson, very friendly guy, awesome. He doesn't send out such emails, and I sort of understand why. He doesn't really like it when he gets those emails from other faculty looking for postdoc jobs for their graduate students. There's sort of this whole process set up, and he likes to do it just once. So I very much understand that perspective. This goes back to Adam's question at the beginning. Hey, should I email faculty I know ahead of time, telling them to look for me? Probably, if you start that conversation with a select few people ahead of time, it then makes it maybe more reasonable for you or your advisor to follow up afterwards to say hey, I suspect your search is closed, but please do reach out if there's any other openings you know about. Similarly, this relates back to, should I apply to 35 places and customize them, or should I apply to 70 places? In some sense, if you do apply to 70 places, you do have your foot in the door at more places. So that Sweden place, I would have felt more comfortable reaching out to had Joshua applied compared to if he didn't. Let's talk about COVID. So I was not really a faculty member in 2009 when the economy crashed, and there have been crashes before then. I asked a couple faculty who are older than me what they're expecting for the job market next year. The tenure-track job market is definitely going to be harder, I think. So there are going to be hiring freezes where CSU math department, we're not going to hire tenure-track in the math department next year, I predict. Will that trickle down to postdocs? I think so. Not as badly, but it will. So I think fewer departments will be hiring postdocs. Hopefully, there'll still be departmental postdocs, and postdocs are related to individual grants that individual PIs have. My advice is to not stress about this too much. All you can do is prepare now. So most people don't really touch any of these documents until the fall, okay? So most people, myself included, don't do anything regarding applying towards jobs until the fall. And then the first day of the fall, they email folks asking for letters of recommendation, and they start writing their research and teaching statement. Your last year is by far your busiest year of graduate school for many, many reasons. Applying for what's next, writing up your thesis, which takes longer than everybody predicts. So it's not a bad idea to start making template materials now. You can make a 3-page research statement now that you'll adjust again in the fall, and turn into a 5-page one and turn into a liberal arts one. You can make a draft cover letter now for research postdocs and for liberal arts positions that you then have ready that you can customize as different jobs open up. All right, so that's all my prepared material. We'll move to public questions, but then we can stop the recording at some point for private questions. So take it away with your questions.
Henry, I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there anything in your application materials that you think could have been better?
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Teaching statement. I'm actually quite happy with my teaching statement. I think now you do need to talk a little bit more about other forms of learning. So lecture-based learning doesn't work for everybody, and you want to acknowledge that to some degree, I think. But that's more of a change in the underlying landscape. I really like my teaching statement. Diversity statement definitely could have been better. I just didn't have much experience or documented time devoted to diversity, and that's okay. I expect that's the case for many graduate students, and that's fine. You have jobs that are not explicitly related to diversity. So diversity statement, yeah, clearly could have been better, but here I want to emphasize, don't stress about it. Same thing for publication list. Yeah, your publication list can always be longer, but again, here, this is one I would stress, don't worry about it. Research statement. Let's see. I don't know. It's tough to say, right? Like, how do you want to write a 5-page research statement when you expect some people are only going to read the first page, right? So maybe this bullet pointed list, there's pros and cons of it. Maybe this would have worked better as a narrative, a little bit more paragraph form. I'm not sure. Let me say that when you're talking about theoretical things, like the spectral sequence, you are talking to a smaller audience than you might think. So my thesis had both pure and applied components, and I think I felt the need at the time to really emphasize the pure components because I thought I was going to be written off by pure topologists if I didn't. That wasn't how sort of things went in my area. I think in applied topology, applications are very valued. But that depends on the research area, right? But let's say this, even in algebraic geometry, where everyone's working on very theoretical things, speak to an algebraic geometer as well who hasn't heard of your specific topic before. Yeah, so Alex, I don't know, I'm pretty happy with my stuff, but I'm sure you can, that's good because you'll find stuff to improve upon, right? I'm showing my own style, whereas everyone has their own style. So you want your own style to come through. That's another thing that I am happy with. I'm happy with how my style came through, and you'll want your own style to come through.
And then more generally, are there any common mistakes that most people make?
Yeah, teaching statement, they talk too vaguely. Just super abstract. Get in some details, some specific moments in class, even if they're very short, just a single question or a single way you teach a certain topic. That's my opinion. Research statements, people don't realize how broad of an audience they're talking to. So liberal arts institutions, right, if you're getting a job there, you're going to be the only person in your area probably. So you're writing strictly to people not in your area, sort of, if you're applying to a, a liberal arts institution that has only 10 faculty. And you also want to write broadly for the reason that I mentioned, that let's say there's somebody, Peter Bubenik, who knows your work and likes it, and Peter Bubenik in your area wants to hire you. That's great. He'll read your research statement, but he already knows he likes you. He needs to convince his colleague in a nearby area, hey, a geometer, hey, you're not a topologist, but you should be interested in Alex for these reasons. So you're writing less towards people in your area than you are writing towards people in nearby areas. So you do need to get to the nitty gritty, right? So you can't cut out all of the points of your research, right? But you need to spend some time introducing it in a friendly way, for people not in your area. So, like this first paragraph is pretty good. Like there's really no math symbols in that first paragraph, right? So this is something that a geometer or a combinatorialist would say, okay, I can understand at least some things Henry says, right? And then maybe I get into more details, and this is showing both the geometer and the topologist and the combinatorialist that there is some meat in my work. Maybe it only makes sense to the topologist. But yeah, these paragraphs here are the most important parts. These are the paragraphs that are read by everybody. The actual details, the actual theorem you proved, is the part that's read by the 25% of the people reading. So that would be the most common mistake with your research statement. Spend at least a couple paragraphs very generally at the start before you get more and more specific. An advantage of breaking it up into sections is maybe you give people new re-entry points. So here, this is a little bit modular in the sense that they can get lost and rejoin in this section here. So that might be something that's appropriate for some of you. Good question. Other questions? Some of you might have more time this summer in the sense of some of your summer plans got canceled. It might not be a bad idea to block off a day or two. You all try to write together. You all try to, you give yourself 10 hours, 8 hours, 6 hours to try to write a 3-page research statement and a 1-page teaching statement. It's not a bad motivating idea.
So Henry, do you think that a good time to start writing all these statements is like the summer before you're applying for jobs? Shall we younger people be thinking about them already?
Yeah, definitely. The point is it's always easier to revise a draft than it is to start from scratch, okay? And the typical way this goes is fall of the year you're applying for jobs, you start making a draft. And my first research statement I write for the first position I apply for, maybe it's a research postdoc, and then I adapt it for a liberal arts institution. And then I'm already burnt out because I'm teaching, I'm trying to figure out the last proof in my thesis. Fall is a very busy time. I'm anxious because I'm asking people for letters of recommendation, and I'm already just like in a bad mood for my entire last year. If you write a draft research statement in June and a draft teaching statement in June, say 3-page research statement and 1-page teaching statement, it's only 4 pages, so it's not that killer, right? And it gets the thought process started. And in the fall, then you already have a draft. And it's much easier to take this draft, say, okay, wait, now I've proven that, or, I can't understand that. I can't understand what I wrote. Let me revise it. And then I'll clean up my 3-page research statement, and then I'll turn it into 2 versions, one for research postdoc and one for a liberal arts. I think you're just much happier if you already have drafts that you're editing as opposed to creating all this stuff on the fly in the same semester as you're looking at mathjobs.org, as you're looking at what's up there, as you're bugging your letter writers, hey, please do remember to write a letter for me. Yeah. So when are deadlines? Deadlines, Joshua, are like October through February?
Yeah, I think the earliest deadlines, which were mostly the liberal arts ones, started in mid-October and went through December, and postdoc ones started in like mid-November and went through a long time.
Yeah. So it's a lot of work if you start in August. It's a lot of work to write research statement, teaching statement, cover letter, diversity statement, ask letters of recommendation writers to write letters for you, find jobs to apply for on math jobs. It's a lot of work. You don't really have time to do research if you're teaching and applying for jobs, right? I think that's pretty common like attitude, when you're applying for jobs, you don't have time to do research. Unless you start a full like quarter or semester ahead of time, like this summer, get drafts of these materials, and then I think you might be a lot happier in the fall.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, your research statement will change from the one you write in the summer to the fall, but strictly in a good way, right? It's not wasted work. It's getting your mind thinking about it already, and then you just explain things better as you adjust them. Other questions?
Henry, just to sort of ease people's concerns, so in the case that you don't get a job, do you have any stories about the worst case scenarios, like just end up being like a baker's apprentice or something? What's the yeah, like, I mean, yeah, do you, like, I guess what's your opinion on the worst case scenario that could happen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the worst case scenario is you apply for jobs your 5th year, you don't get any jobs, you stay for 6th year, your department has funding for 6th year, you stay for 6th year, you apply for academic jobs your 6th year, you don't get any, you didn't apply for anything else, and then you're sort of like, only then do you start applying for other things. So I'll say that math departments are very friendly places and look out for their own. So, we have a lot of really like awesome graduate students who have contributed a lot, and the faculty will be looking to help you out. So graduate students have stayed on as postdocs at CSU, for a variety of reasons. Graduate students have stayed on as lecturers at CSU. Graduates have are applying to staff positions at CSU. So definitely there will be, faculty members at CSU who are looking out for you and helping you out. But I would say like do the due diligence to just prepare for that or have a plan in place. So I think with Joshua, his plan was like, had he gotten 0 jobs, probably he would have stayed for 6th year. I might be guessing. So that can be the case for many of you. You should ask yourself, what would you do if you don't get, let's say you're shooting for a research postdoc and you don't get one. What would you do? Would you want to do a teaching job, like an instructor position? Or like an adjunct position. So you can get a job where you might be teaching 3 classes in a semester and you have very little time for research, but you can keep doing some research, maybe with 10% of your time if you're very motivated, and from there apply to a postdoc position. So people do that. It's not fun, but people do it, and it's a sign of perseverance, so like when these economic downturns happen, I think unfortunately more people have to do things like that, but you can sort of persevere in adjunct positions or lectureship positions for a while. Where does industry rank on your list? So would you rather have a low paid adjunct lectureship type position, that gives you the an extra chance to apply for a research postdoc the next year, or how much would you like a job applying in industry where you make more than I do, type of thing. So think about what your preference on that scale is. Maybe what I'll say is graduate school brings its stresses for everybody, and when I was a graduate student, my backup plan was always to teach high school. And I told myself, hey, like, I enjoy teaching a lot. I think I would be a very good high school teacher, and I know I could like do well at it and feel like I'm contributing. So that's going to be my backup plan, like go teach high school. That gave me the guts, I don't know, to sort of like pursue a professorship, even though it wasn't guaranteed. I knew I had this backup plan where I'd be happy teaching high school. We are sort of lucky in math that even if you're in a very pure area of math, if you decide to go in industry, there are companies that will hire you and give you a chance to learn the software, the data skills they want you to have. They know that you can because you're a math PhD. So that might be a backup that's attractive for some of you. You shouldn't be scared. I think CSU has done a good job at placing its graduates in research postdocs and liberal arts positions, and even tenure-track liberal arts positions. Given how much teaching experience our students have, you're often very qualified for faculty positions that have higher teaching loads. So where would that rank on your list? So yeah, I would think about it ahead of time. You sort of know what your options are if you don't get a research postdoc or a liberal arts position. I would maybe just make a mental list of how you rank those ahead of time, and hopefully you'll find a plan B that's encouraging you in the sense of, hey, if this doesn't work out, I would be happy with my plan B. That gives me the confidence to go for plan A, without abandon. And do talk with your advisor. What does it look like if I don't get any of these positions? What would you do next? Would we email, your faculty friends sort of asking for positions, or, what do you see from me if that fails? Could I stay for a 6th year? I know that's CSU almost always grants that, but it's not guaranteed. That's my rambles on that for you, Adam.
Thanks, that helped.
Other questions? If not, thanks so much. We can go towards private questions. So Josh, if you stop the recording, we'll see if you have any private questions, but feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat about this stuff more anytime.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Yeah, and I'll
Yep.
stop the recording. So if anyone's